May 23, 1944. The Liri Valley, Italy. The earth trembled as 800 Allied guns opened fire at once, tearing the dawn apart with fire and steel. Through the smoke and shattered limestone, men of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division rose from their muddy ditches and began to walk. Ahead of them, hidden in the morning haze, lay the Hitler Line, a fortress of concrete steel and buried tank turrets that had stopped the American 5th Army cold and bled the British 8th Army white for weeks. The Germans called the Canadians colonial farm boys playing soldier. In 12 hours, those farm boys would do what 2 empires could not. Before we dive into this story, if you're captivated by these forgotten moments of history, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another chapter of the war. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether it's Toronto, Texas, or Tasmania. We want to hear from you. Now, back to May 1944, to a valley in Italy where reputation meant nothing and results meant everything. The Canadian soldiers, advancing through the wheat fields that morning, carried no illusions of glory. They had seen the burnt-out Sherman tanks littering the approach roads. They had passed British stretcher-bearers carrying men with vacant eyes and shattered limbs. They knew the mathematics of what lay ahead. The Hitler Line had been engineered specifically to kill them. Every yard of ground was pre-sighted by artillery. Every approach was mined. Every bunker was reinforced with feet of concrete and interlocking fields of machine gun fire. This was not a battle they were expected to win. It was a battle they were expected to survive long enough to occupy the enemy while someone, somewhere, found another way forward. And in that moment, as the barrage lifted and the first bullets snapped through the air, they realized something that would change the course of the Italian campaign. Nobody was coming to save them. There was no other way forward. They were the plan. To understand what the Canadians faced that morning requires understanding what the Liri Valley had become by the spring of 1944. Winston Churchill had sold the Italian campaign to the Allied High Command as an attack on the soft underbelly of Europe. It was perhaps the most catastrophically inaccurate metaphor of the entire war. Italy was not soft. It was a spine of mountains and narrow valleys designed by geography itself for defense. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, understood this terrain with the precision of a surgeon understanding anatomy. He didn't need to defeat the Allies in open battle. He only needed to make them pay in blood for every mile of ground until they lost the will to continue. By May 1944, the Allies had been grinding forward for months. Monte Cassino had fallen at terrible cost. The ancient monastery reduced to rubble, its slopes soaked with Polish, British, Indian, and American blood. But Kesselring had prepared a fallback position 6 miles behind Cassino that made the monastery look like a warm-up. The Hitler Line, originally called the Sanger Line until propaganda renamed it, stretched across the Liri Valley like a steel trap waiting to close. It was not merely a defensive line, it was an industrial killing machine. German engineers, using forced labor and the organizational genius of the Todd organization, had spent months turning the valley floor into a nightmare. Anti-tank ditches 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep stretched for miles, deep enough to swallow a Sherman tank whole. These weren't just obstacles, they were kill zones, presided by artillery and mortars, so that any vehicle attempting to cross would be destroyed before it reached the other side. Behind the ditches lay minefields so dense that in some sectors there was a mine every 3 feet. Teller mines designed to rip the tracks off tanks. S-mines that leaped from the ground and exploded at chest height, spraying ball bearings in every direction. But the true innovation, the weapon that terrified Allied tank crews more than anything else, was the Panzer term. The Germans had taken the turrets from their Panther tanks, arguably the best medium tank of the war, and mounted them on buried concrete bunkers. These emplacements presented almost no silhouette above ground. A tanker scanning the horizon might see nothing but grass and farmland, and then suddenly his Sherman would be burning from a 75mm armor-piercing shell fired from a kilometer away. The Panther's gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman like paper. The Sherman's gun could barely scratch the Panther turret, even at close range. It was a technological mismatch that meant death. By mid-May, the American and British armies had been battering against the outer defenses of the Liri Valley for weeks. They were not incompetent. They were not cowardly. They were exhausted. The U.S. Fifth Army had taken horrific casualties attempting to flank the German positions at Anzio. The British 8th, Army had thrown division after division against the approaches to the Hitler line and been thrown back each time. Morale was fraying. In foxholes from the American sector to the British lines, soldiers looked at the flat, open killing ground of the Leary Valley and saw no way forward. Into this stalemate came the Canadians. The 1st Canadian Corps, composed of the 1st Infantry Division and the 5th Armored Division, had been fighting in Italy since the invasion of Sicily in 1943. They were volunteers, every one of them. Canada had not needed to draft men for overseas service. These were wheat farmers from Saskatchewan who understood machinery and improvisation. Lumberjacks from British Columbia with shoulders built for hard labor. Hard rock miners from Northern Ontario who knew explosives intimately. They were not professional soldiers in the European sense. They were pragmatists who learned quickly and adapted faster. They had earned their reputation in the streets of Ortona in December 1943, where they fought the German 1st Parachute Division in a brutal house-to-house battle that lasted nearly 2 weeks. Unable to advance through streets swept by machine gun fire, the Canadians invented mouse-holing, blasting through interior walls to move from building to building without exposing themselves to fire. They ground the elite German paratroopers down room by room until the town was theirs. The Germans called it Little Stalingrad. The Canadians called it Tuesday. When General Oliver Leese, commander of the 8th Army, looked at the Hitler line in May 1944, he made a calculation. The Americans and British would maintain pressure on the flanks. But the main assault, the killing blow, would be delivered by the Canadians. It was a heavy responsibility. The entire Italian campaign, the road to Rome itself, depended on whether these so-called colonial amateurs could accomplish what the great armies of 2 empires could not. In the staging areas behind the line, Canadian soldiers prepared with the quiet efficiency of men who understood exactly what was coming. They cleaned their Bren guns and Lee Enfield rifles, they sharpened bayonets, they wrote letters home and sealed them, handing them to chaplains just in case. One young private, writing by candlelight in a tent that smelled of wet canvas and cigarette smoke, captured the mood perfectly. They say this line can't be broken. They say the concrete is too thick and the wire is too deep. I suppose tomorrow we'll find out if they're right. The plan was simple because it had to be. There would be no clever flanking maneuver. The terrain didn't allow for it. No airborne assault behind enemy lines. The Luftwaffe still controlled enough airspace to make that suicidal. This would be a frontal assault. The infantry would advance under a creeping artillery barrage, clear paths through the minefields, and knock out the bunkers. Only then could the tanks of the 5th Armored Division punch through and race for the Melfa River. It was the kind of plan that looked clean on a map and messy in reality. The kind of plan measured in casualties rather than kilometers. On the evening of May 22nd, as the sun set over the Leary Valley, the Canadian battalions moved to their start lines under cover of smoke and darkness. The Royal Canadian Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders, the Carleton and York Regiment, they lay in the wet grass, checking their watches, waiting for dawn. A company commander turned to his sergeant, both of them staring into the darkness where the Hitler line waited invisible and lethal. His voice was quiet, carrying the weight of everything unsaid. Tomorrow, the world will hear that Canada broke Hitler's line. Or they'll hear, we were broken, trying. 6 o'clock, May 23, 1944, the barrage began. 800 Allied guns opened fire in a synchronized thunder that shook the earth and tore the sky apart. For 15 minutes, the Hitler line disappeared behind a wall of smoke, fire, and pulverized limestone. High explosive shells cratered the earth. White phosphorus rounds set the wheat fields ablaze. Counter-battery fire targeted the German artillery positions with mathematical precision. It was the largest artillery concentration in the Italian campaign, and its purpose was singular to suppress the German defenders long enough for the infantry to reach the wire. Then the whistle blew. From ditches and wheat fields across a 2-mile front, the men of the 1st Canadian Division stood up and began to walk. The Carleton and York Regiment on the left, the Seaforth Highlanders in the center, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry on the right, they advanced in waves, trying to stay just behind the creeping barrage, close enough to reach the German positions before the defenders recovered, but not so close they walked into their own shells. The German response was immediate. The barrage had not killed them all. From concrete bunkers sunk deep into the earth, MG-42 machine guns opened fire with their distinctive tearing sound, 1,200 rounds per minute. a rate of fire so high it sounded like cloth ripping. The lead platoons were cut down in seconds. Men fell in the wheat fields and vineyards, their bodies disappearing into the tall grass. But the Canadians did not stop. When a section was wiped out, the survivors crawled forward. When an officer fell, a sergeant took command. When the sergeant fell, a private picked up the radio and kept moving. This was where the Canadian assault differed from what had come before. The Americans, facing similar defenses, had often pulled back to call in airstrikes and regroup. The British, when pinned down, looked for flanking routes. The Canadians, hemmed in by the narrow valley and driven by the knowledge that there was no alternative, simply absorbed the casualties and kept walking. It was not bravery in the Hollywood sense. It was something grimmer and more pragmatic, the understanding that the only way out was through. The German defensive system was designed to separate infantry from their tank support. Sherman tanks, pushing forward to help the infantry, found themselves navigating through dust clouds so thick their commanders had to stand exposed in their turrets just to see. And waiting for them in that dust were the Panzer. A Sherman might round a copse of trees and find itself staring at a Panther turret 200 yards away. The exchange was almost always fatal for the Canadian crew. The Panther's gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor at twice that distance. The Sherman's gun could barely scratch the Panther turret, even at point-blank range. By mid-morning, the battlefield had dissolved into chaos. The neat arrows on the tactical maps meant nothing. This was combat reduced to its most primitive form. Small groups of men fighting bunker to bunker, trench to trench. The Seaforth Highlanders clearing a strong point with grenades and bayonets. The Carleton and Yorks using their own bodies to bridge the barbed wire so others could cross. Tank crews driving their Shermans recklessly close to German positions, trading armor for accuracy, blasting high-explosive shells directly into firing slits at ranges where a miss was impossible. But so was survival if the enemy shot first. One engagement captured the essence of the Canadian assault. A single German heavy machine gun position was holding up an entire company, pinning them in a shallow ditch. The supporting Sherman had been knocked out, its crew dead or scattered. By all military logic, the attack should have stalled. Instead, a corporal whose name would never make it into the history books led 4 men in a flanking assault through a minefield. They crawled on their bellies through the wire, got within grenade range, and silenced the gun. 3 of the 5 died doing it. The survivors didn't wait for recognition. They picked up their rifles and kept moving. Inside the German command bunkers, disbelief was turning to alarm. The defenders were elite troops, veterans of the Eastern Front, paratroopers who had held Cassino for months. They were used to seeing Allied attacks falter when casualties mounted. But these Canadians were not faltering. They were taking horrific losses. Battalions reduced to company strength, companies reduced to platoons. But the line kept moving forward. The carefully constructed defensive web, designed to channel attackers into kill zones, was being disrupted by sheer stubborn momentum. By early afternoon, the Hitler line was beginning to crack. Near the town of Aquino, in the center of the Canadian advance, the defensive fire was slackening. Not because the Germans were retreating, but because the bunkers had been silenced. Canadian infantry had fought their way into the trench system. Sherman tanks were pushing through gaps blown in the wire by engineers who had crawled forward under fire to place explosive charges. The geometry of the battlefield was changing. A bunker that was impregnable from the front was suddenly vulnerable from the side. A panzerdom that had dominated a killing zone was blind to the infantry now behind it. The order came down from division headquarters: send in the armor. The 5th Canadian Armored Division, held in reserve for this moment, roared forward. Their Shermans poured through the gaps torn open by the infantry, tracks grinding over shattered concrete and twisted wire. This was the exploitation phase, the moment when a tactical breach becomes a strategic breakthrough. The tanks raced for the Melfa River, the last natural barrier before Rome. For the German 10th Army, the situation was becoming untenable. Field Marshal Kesselring, receiving reports from the front, faced a nightmare scenario. The Hitler line, the fortress named after the Führer himself. The position that was supposed to bleed the Allies dry had been penetrated in less than 24 hours. To stay was to risk encirclement. To retreat was to abandon the capital. He chose survival. The order went out: withdraw to the next defensive line. The road to Rome was open, but as the dust settled and the firing slackened, the cost became clear. The 1st Canadian Corps had suffered over 1,000 casualties in a single day. Some infantry companies that had gone into battle with 120 men came out with 20. The wheat fields in front of the Hitler line were carpeted with khaki uniforms. Burning tanks smoldered in the rain that began falling that evening, their crews buried where they fell. A Canadian war correspondent, walking through the breach the next morning, wrote, "It is a landscape of the dead. Shermans burned quietly in the drizzle. Men lay where they had fallen, always facing forward. The wire is draped with uniforms, like laundry on a line. This is what victory looks like when you measure it in yards." In the days following the breach, the Allied armies surged north. The German 10th Army, its defensive spine broken, retreated in disarray toward Rome. Canadian tank columns pushed forward, bypassing German strongpoints, driving for the capital. On June 4, 1944, American troops of the 5th Army entered Rome. It was a monumental achievement, the first Axis capital to fall. Church bells rang in London. Celebrations erupted in New York. For a brief moment, the eyes of the world focused on Italy and the men who had fought their way up the peninsula. But history is a cruel editor. Less than 48 hours after Rome fell, on June 6, 1944, the Allied Armada landed on the beaches of Normandy, D-Day. The scale of Operation Overlord was so vast, so cinematically perfect for newsreels, that it eclipsed everything else. The Italian campaign, the breaking of the Hitler line, the 1,000 Canadian soldiers who had bled for every inch of the Leary Valley. All of it was relegated to the back pages. The men of the 1st Canadian Corps did not get a parade. They were quietly pulled off the line, refitted, and sent to the next battle. And the next, and the next. For decades afterward, the popular narrative of the Second World War focused on the superpowers, the American industrial juggernaut, the British stoicism under the Blitz, the Soviet sacrifice at Stalingrad. The Canadian contribution in Italy became a footnote, a chapter skipped in high school textbooks. Some soldiers returning home were bitterly called D-Day Dodgers by civilians who thought they had avoided the real war in France. The men who had broken the Hitler line, who had walked into machine gun fire because there was no other way forward, were told they had missed the important battles. But to accept that narrative is to ignore the truth carved into the headstones of the Casino War Cemetery. The breaking of the Hitler line was not a sideshow. It was a pivot point. It proved that the German war machine, for all its technological superiority and defensive genius, could be broken by determination and combined arms warfare executed with brutal efficiency. But to accept that narrative is to ignore the truth carved into the headstones of the Casino War Cemetery. The breaking of the Hitler line was not a sideshow. It was a pivot point. It proved that the German war machine, for all its technological superiority and defensive genius, could be broken by determination and combined arms warfare executed with brutal efficiency. In the spring of 1944, German commanders mocked the Canadians as colonial farm boys. They believed their Hitler line was unbreakable. The Americans had tried and bled. The British had been thrown back. Then came the volunteers, wheat farmers, lumberjacks, miners, men who were not supposed to be soldiers at all. They walked straight into the teeth of the fortress, named after the Führer himself. 12 hours later, it was broken. The road to Rome lay open. The legacy lives not in films or monuments, but in the silence of the Leary Valley, where the soil still remembers the day when underestimation met determination and determination won.